Mr. Henry had only planned to run a simple errand, but what was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon turned into an unimaginable nightmare. A single overreaction, a wrong decision, and the entire Willow Creek Police Department, WCPD, was left in shock, setting off a chain of events no one could have foreseen. What really happened after that fateful gunshot? Stay tuned as we uncover a story that will leave you heartbroken and reflective. If you enjoy heartfelt, meaningful stories, don't forget to follow us so you won't miss the next impactful tale. Under the warm glow of the afternoon sun, a sleek luxury car shimmered in the parking lot, catching glances filled with admiration, envy, or suspicion. Mr. Henry, an 80-year-old man with neatly combed silver hair and a deliberate yet dignified demeanor, gently parked his car. Each of his movements exuded the calm assurance of someone who had spent decades behind the wheel. Today was meant to be just another day. A quick stop at Greenfield Groceries for a few essentials. The parking lot buzzed with life, the hum of engines, the murmur of conversations, and the rhythmic clatter of shopping carts against the concrete floor. Mr. Henry locked his car, tucked the key into his pocket, and began walking towards the store entrance. His steps were slow but purposeful, a routine so familiar it felt like second nature. Inside, he moved methodically, selecting items with precision, politely declining the assistance of staff with a courteous smile. After paying, he headed back to his car, completely unaware that this day would be unlike any other. As he approached his car, his eyes caught something unusual. A tall Officer David, clad in a crisp uniform, standing nearby, watching him intently. A flicker of unease crept into Mr. Henry's mind, but he quickly brushed it off. There's nothing to worry about, he thought. I'm just a man buying groceries. Maintaining his calm exterior, he opened the car door, placed the shopping bag on the passenger seat, and settled into the driver's seat. But then, a sharp knock on the window made him freeze. Lowering the window, he met Officer David's scrutinizing gaze with polite curiosity. Without any preamble or polite inquiry, the officer accused him of stealing the car. The words struck Mr. Henry like a thunderclap. For a moment, he was too stunned to speak, his mind racing to understand why. He was being accused. Gathering himself, he replied with a calm yet bewildered tone, explaining that the car was his, a gift from his successful son, a proud symbol of their bond. His explanation, however, only deepened the officer's suspicion. Officer David's eyes grew colder, his tone more unyielding as he demanded proof of ownership. Mr. Henry searched his jacket pocket but found only his keys and wallet. Who carries a car registration just to go shopping? He wondered silently but maintained his composure, offering to call his son to provide digital copies of the documents. The officer dismissed his suggestion with a wave of his hand, his expression dripping with doubt. Frustration and anger began to simmer within Mr. Henry. Why was this happening? What had he done to deserve this treatment? When Officer David ordered him to step out of the vehicle, Mr. Henry hesitated, glancing at the bag of groceries sitting innocently beside him. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but the indignity of the accusation was unbearable. The officer's posture grew tenser, one hand resting on his belt as if ready to act at the slightest provocation. The air between them thickened with tension, every word of explanation met with a figurative wall. For the first time, Mr. Henry felt the weight of his years pressing down on him. He had always believed in justice, that staying calm and reasonable would resolve misunderstandings. Yet here he was, facing an impenetrable wall of mistrust. His heart pounded, a mix of outrage and apprehension coursing through him. He wasn't just being falsely accused. He was being stripped of his dignity. Yet he knew that keeping his emotions in check was the only way to avoid worsening the situation. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his voice. "Please let me call my son," he pleaded, his tone firm but hopeful. What had started as a peaceful afternoon now unraveled into a nightmare. Sitting in his car, Mr. Henry gripped the steering wheel tightly as Officer David stood resolutely outside, his skeptical glare unwavering, his posture exuding authority. Mr. Henry repeated his story, recounting how the car was a gift from his son, a gesture of love and pride. But his words fell on deaf ears. A surge of helplessness and indignation rose within him, his voice tinged with desperation as he tried to reason. "Surely there's a way to resolve this, without making it worse," he implored, his tone steady but edged with urgency. The officer, however, merely repeated his command, "Step out of the car." Mr. Henry remained seated, glancing again at the bag of groceries beside him. The humiliation of the moment gnawed at him. He had done nothing wrong. Why was he being treated like this? Officer David's patience had worn thin. He moved closer, his voice rising, his eyes scrutinizing every slight motion as if anticipating defiance. Mr. Henry raised his hands, a gesture of compliance meant to reassure, but in the officer's tense state, it was perceived as a threat. In a split second, the situation spiraled out of control. The officer's hand went to his holster, and the deafening sound of a gunshot shattered the charged silence. The bullet tore through Mr. Henry's leg, sending a searing wave of pain coursing through his body. He let out a scream, collapsing forward as blood began pooling beneath him. The shopping bag tumbled to the floor, its contents spilling chaotically, a surreal contrast to the stark reality of the moment. The noise drew the attention of everyone nearby. A crowd quickly gathered, their eyes filled with confusion and outrage. Some pulled out their phones to record, murmurs growing louder with each passing moment, but no one dared to step forward. Officer David, unfazed by the stares of the crowd, knelt down and roughly handcuffed Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry groaned, his face contorted in pain, but his protests were drowned out by the throbbing agony radiating from his wound. The dark red blood pooled on the pavement, painting a grim scene that left onlookers stunned. The crushing weight of helplessness hung heavy as Officer David dragged Mr. Henry, nearly pulling him along, to the patrol car. Every step was pure torment for his injured leg, yet no one in the crowd dared to intervene. Inside the patrol car, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving Mr. Henry seated in a cold sweat, pain etched deeply on his face. The drive to the Willow Creek police station was excruciatingly long. Every jolt of the vehicle sent fresh waves of agony through his wound, a constant reminder of how an ordinary day had turned into an unbearable nightmare. He couldn't stop asking himself, how did it come to this? Over a simple trip to the store. When they arrived at the station, Officer David yanked Mr. Henry from the car, his roughness undiminished despite the man's evident exhaustion and pain. Mr. Henry's legs trembled, his face pale, yet the officer remained unrelenting, escorting him into the cold confines of the station and locking him in a sterile, metallic room. The clang of the metal door echoed through the space, sealing away any remaining hope or faith. Seated on the bench, Mr. Henry hung his head, his breaths shallow and uneven. Blood still seeped from his wound, dripping onto the floor in a slow, haunting rhythm. After what felt like an eternity, another officer entered and informed him that he was allowed to make a phone call. With trembling hands, Mr. Henry picked up the receiver, struggling to press the familiar numbers. On the other end of the line, his son's voice was immediately filled with concern. Choking back tears, Mr. Henry recounted the entire ordeal, from the gunshot to the humiliation and his disbelief at being treated so unjustly. His voice, raw with pain, cut deeply into his son's heart. There was silence on the other end, a heavy, tense pause. Then, the stillness gave way to a furious determination, like a fire igniting and spreading uncontrollably. The son's emotions surged as he listened to the harrowing story. The image of his elderly father, an innocent man, being shot and treated like a criminal, stoked his indignation to a fever pitch. His voice, steady but brimming with resolve, came through the line. "Don't worry, Dad. I'm coming, and I won't let this go unanswered." Mr. Henry hung up the phone, his hands still shaking. Leaning back against the cold wall, he closed his eyes, utterly drained both physically and emotionally. His last hope now rested in his son, the belief that he could bring justice to a situation so painfully unjust. The son burst into the Willow Creek police station, his eyes scanning the room for someone in charge. The officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the storm of anger radiating from him. Without hesitation, he demanded an explanation, his voice sharp and unyielding, leaving no room for evasion. My father, an elderly man with no criminal record, was shot, arrested, and thrown into a cell like a criminal. Why? His words cut through the tension like a blade. Activity in the station halted as officers turned their attention to the scene, some retreating into whispered exchanges. They all knew him, a prominent, influential figure in the community. His voice carried the weight of authority and an unshakable resolve, pressing down on everyone in the room. Within moments, Chief Thomas appeared, a tall, imposing man with an air of authority. His pristine uniform only added to his commanding presence. His eyes met those of the son, and recognition flickered across his face. They had crossed paths at social events before. Maintaining a calm tone, the chief asked, "What happened here?" The son turned to him, his voice thick with indignation as he recounted the events. Each word hit like a hammer, exposing the injustice his father had endured. A frail, elderly man treated with brutality and indignity. Chief Thomas listened intently, his expression darkening as the details became clear. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the chief wasted no time. He ordered all related evidence to be gathered immediately. He invited the son into his office, where the noise of the bustling station faded into a tense silence. Inside the office, the atmosphere was heavy as the chief pulled up the security footage from the parking lot. The screen displayed a clear view of Mr. Henry slowly approaching his car, placing the shopping bag on the passenger seat, and starting the engine. Officer David appeared, standing by the car, initiating a conversation. Mr. Henry, calm and composed, clearly attempted to explain, showing no signs of aggression. Then the gun was drawn and the shot rang out. The son clenched his jaw, his fists tightening as the footage showed his father collapsing, clutching his leg in agony. Chief Thomas stared at the screen, rewinding and analyzing every moment. His face grew increasingly grim. The evidence was irrefutable. Mr. Henry had done nothing wrong, and Officer David's actions were egregiously excessive. After a few moments of tense silence, the chief looked up, his eyes firm. He ordered Mr. Henry's immediate release and initiated an internal investigation. Simultaneously, he demanded reports and witness statements from everyone involved. "This matter will be resolved thoroughly," he assured the son. When Mr. Henry was finally brought out of the holding cell, the son's anger was barely contained. His father limped forward, his leg crudely bandaged, wincing with every step. Yet, amidst the fury, relief began to seep into the son's heart. At least his father was free from the cold, isolating cell. Stepping forward, he caught his father in a quick but protective embrace, as though shielding him from any remaining harm. Before leaving, the son turned back to face the officers. His voice was cold and resolute. "I want to know what the next steps are. Who will be held accountable for this?" The police chief stepped out of his office, solemnly assuring that the matter would be fully investigated and that Officer David would face appropriate consequences. The son nodded, his determined gaze unwavering. Nothing could erase the pain his father had endured, but he would not stop fighting. As they exited the station, the son held his father's hand firmly. In his heart, he had already decided. This was no longer just about seeking justice for his father. It was a wake-up call for the entire system. From the beginning, the evidence painted an indisputable picture of Officer David's wrongdoing. The parking lot surveillance footage was reviewed repeatedly, every frame crystal clear and leaving no room for doubt. The video showed Mr. Henry moving slowly and calmly, placing his shopping bag into the car and preparing to leave. There was nothing remotely threatening in his demeanor, and his confusion during the police encounter was evident in every motion. The video captured the escalating tension. Officer David's intimidating stance, his refusal to listen to Mr. Henry's explanation, and the moment he drew his firearm. Each detail added to the narrative of unnecessary escalation, perfectly aligning with Mr. Henry's account. Witnesses from the scene that day were also brought in to give statements. Many confirmed that Mr. Henry had done nothing wrong before being confronted by Officer David. Their testimonies further reinforced the truth. The use of force was unwarranted, excessive, and an abuse of power. A deeper investigation into Officer David's record revealed a troubling pattern of complaints in the past. While none had escalated to violence, reports of rude behavior and overstepping authority painted a clear picture of poor judgment and lack of restraint. When all the evidence was compiled, the conclusion was inescapable. Officer David had acted irrationally. The car legally belonged to Mr. Henry's son, and there was no justification for his actions. In court, the evidence was presented meticulously. The surveillance footage, witness statements, Officer David's disciplinary record, and the physical and emotional trauma inflicted on Mr. Henry. The courtroom was heavy with tension. Public and media attention only added to the gravity of the situation. Officer David sat in the defendant's chair, his face devoid of emotion as the evidence was laid out one piece at a time. He attempted to defend his actions, claiming they stemmed from concerns for public safety, but his arguments failed to sway the civic justice court. The evidence was overwhelming, and his actions were indefensible. In the end, the court found Officer David guilty of abuse of power and excessive use of force. He was dismissed from his position, stripped of all certifications, and banned from working in law enforcement in the future. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. For many, it was proof that justice could prevail, even against those in positions of power. For others, it was a sobering reminder of the consequences of abusing authority. Officer David's name became synonymous with disgrace, his career ruined, and his reputation irreparably damaged. Yet, for Mr. Henry's family, there was little relief. The psychological scars from the incident remained. Though Mr. Henry felt a sense of solace that justice had been served, the trauma of being shot and treated like a criminal lingered. His leg, still healing, was a painful reminder of the day his dignity and safety were stripped away. The son, too, bore the heavy weight of the aftermath. Though grateful the truth had come to light, he was consumed by guilt and anger. He often replayed the events in his mind, imagining even worse outcomes, and couldn't shake the fear that he might have lost his father to such a senseless act. The local community could not remain indifferent to the incident. Discussions about accountability and abuse of power within law enforcement surged. Activists and community leaders pointed out that this case was a prime example of the systemic issues that demanded reform. Protests and public forums were organized, with calls for change to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Officer David, now stripped of his badge and weapon, faced the full force of public outrage. His name dominated headlines, condemned by society at large. His story became a cautionary tale about responsibility and the consequences of abusing power. In the quieter moments after the storm, Mr. Henry and his son gradually began to find peace. They spoke less about the incident, choosing instead to focus on the lessons it brought and how to move forward after the ordeal. For Mr. Henry, the journey to physical and emotional recovery was slow but steady. He drew strength from his family, who stood steadfastly by his side. For his son, the experience only deepened his resolve to fight against injustice. He understood that change couldn't come from just one person, but his father's story could serve as a catalyst to prevent future suffering. Though the scars would remain, they found the strength to move forward, carrying the hope that their pain could illuminate the path toward positive change. This story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of justice, empathy, and responsibility. If you were in this situation, what would you do to uphold what is right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice could spark change and inspire the community. If this story resonates with you, don't hesitate to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of justice and compassion. Thank you for watching and for standing with us. Let's take action together to build a world where everyone is respected and treated fairly. Small, meaningful steps can lead to great change. Wishing you health, happiness, and success.